safer environment. So they are real, and the stories are certainly out there.
So obviously you don't have the pushback in the communist dictatorships because there's no such thing as pushback in a communist dictatorship for long. But in the democratic countries around the world, are you seeing much of a difference in the level of pushback with regards to privacy? And obviously, Europe has been pretty advanced with GDPR, and they're concerned, with privacy. How do you see that, working, between those different geographic regions?
Yeah, and it's a really good point. I think that's one of the, as a supplier and as an industry, the more uneven the adaptation of something, the adoption levels, the more of a challenge it is to really move forward. And we really have seen great differences. As you say, communist countries aside, I think most Western democracies, there's a certain level of concern, and again, appropriately so, to make sure it's managed appropriately. I think the real difference is in what have they done about it, right? And as you say, GDPR in Europe provides at least the advantage of a known quantity, right? It's the uncertainty is gone. You know what you need to do. Now, the challenge there is it's a pretty high bar, right? They really set a high bar in terms of what the restrictions are, and that's giving some people pause in terms of making sure they can really implement all the processes and controls and everything necessary that's asked for of GDPR. But it's known. And so people can make their decisions accordingly. I think in a lot of other areas that the challenge is that it's all over the map. In the U.S., for example, right now there's a bunch of states that are looking at it. We've got 4 states that have actually implemented specific regulations. It's being looked at Congress. So there's the uncertainty of if I deploy something, can I deploy it across the U.S. or is it going to run afoul of certain laws and regulations in certain states? Is the Congress going to do something about it? What are they going to do? And so that uncertainty level is even more paralyzing in some cases, right, than something like GDPR, because it's just the unknown. And as soon as you tell a bunch of lawyers that we don't know what's going to happen and what the rules are going to be, it's a lot easier for them to say no, right? Let's just stop. Let's wait.
Well, a good way for those Western democracies to demonstrate they're embracing it is actually to be deploying it themselves. And you see much of that deployment for public safety, by those European Western democracies?
Yeah, it really, we're seeing it a lot. It's hit and miss. We're seeing a lot more in democratic regions in South America and Southeast Asia and in India. Other democracies that maybe if you get away from what you think of as the Western democracies in Western Europe and the U.S. and North America, you're seeing a fair bit of deployment elsewhere. It happens. It's hit and miss, right? It certainly in the U.S. there's been pockets of deployment. There have been pockets of deployment in Western Europe where they feel comfortable getting over that bar. But it's if you say, hey, at the state, at the municipal level, et cetera, are people really looking aggressively at this? The answer is no, right? Because they just don't know where it's going to happen.
How about the UK? The UK, 25 years ago, were really the leaders in town center, public area, closed circuit television surveillance. I mean, back in the days of analog, and they would have
the actual.
They would actually have civilians, watching the video, as a backup to help, guide the police on where they were seeing issues. How has it been going there?
Very little. And again, it's a perfect fit, right? You've got this incredibly widely deployed, video surveillance system throughout a lot of the urban areas there, with a mass of humans, right? Doing, looking at it, et cetera. It's a perfect fit to improve the effectiveness of all that, speed the response, do all the things that they're trying to do anyway, right? With less people and higher accuracy. And, with few exceptions. Again, I think there's some at the national security level, right? That we can't necessarily talk about, but they're there. But in terms of, the London police, et cetera, they haven't really embraced it. We've been involved in a number of opportunities and projects in the UK, some of their large transit systems, some other deployments, where at this point they have just made the decision to stop and wait and see. And we actually had a fantastic trial that we had deployed that was really looking to utilize the system to protect some identified vulnerable people of the population from entering into areas that would be risky to them in high transportation areas, right? And ran a trial, very highly successful. Everybody was gung ho, and unfortunately at that point in time had the lawyers say, let's put it on hold, let's stop, let's wait, let's see where this thing evolves. So in the Western democracies, if you will, it is pretty hit and miss.
Just touch base real quick about talking about accuracy. So the studies that have been done, the technology obviously has come pretty far.
Yeah.
And now we're getting to the point where it's getting almost to the point of the same capability of fingerprinting. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah. As I said, one of the big elements there is just I think there's more variability, right? So, fingerprinting's gotten to the point now. I like to think about things I grew up with, and it was back in the day when CDs were introduced, right? And you were really concerned about the quality of the CD player, and it was a big difference, right? How what the processing rate was, and how many times oversampling and everything else, because you could hear the difference, right? And then about 2 years later, it was like, yeah, there was differences, but it was so far beyond what the human ear could hear, it didn't matter. They were all great, and $50, and it was a great CD player, right? Fingerprinting's kind of gotten there to that point. It's mature enough as a technology. Facial recognition, certainly the capability is there, but we're still in that area where there's a lot more variability, right, to what you get. You can get some, people talk about, free or low cost, or, what is available on the facial recognition side. That can be lower quality, much more dependent upon the camera angle, lighting, all sorts of things, or with a high degree of very advanced systems with higher processors, incredibly, incredibly accurate. And as I said, certainly to the point where far beyond what the human eye can perceive. And I think the other element associated with that is, clearly some of the concerns around bias, different ethnic biases, et cetera. And while those are real, they also tend to follow that spread. Lower end systems show a lot more bias, right? If you're really investing in a higher end system that's gone through the development, the training, you've got higher level processors, GPUs, et cetera, that you're deploying this on. We get to the point where they are different. They're typically statistically insignificant, and can kind of just be in that ebb and flow of, hey, if it's deployed in one country where that's what you're utilizing it on, and that's what it gets trained on, it tends to get better with that, proportionate ethnicity. And when it gets deployed in another area with a different ethnicity, and that's what it starts to get trained on, it becomes better with that ethnicity, right? Almost again like the human eye and our own individual biases when you're talking about artificial intelligence. That's what happens. And it's not, again, inherent in the technology so much as the fact that, where it's used more, it gets better. And where it's exposed to less, sometimes it doesn't perform quite as well at that point in time.
I think that's one of the things the general public just doesn't really understand when you're talking about artificial intelligence and machine learning, is that it's one of those things where it, in essence, has a brain and is learning and it gets better at time.
Yeah. And
for the most part, people are looking at it as a calculator. 2 + 2 gives you 4 every single time.
Yeah.
And it's just something that,
And if it says 3.9, something's wrong with it, right? And in this case, that's not really true. It's just, right? Again, that's where it's at in its evolution at that point in time and what it's been exposed to. So, yeah.
Right. Well, that's a great point to leave it at before we go into the future of where this solution is going in segment 3. Remind everyone you are listening to the Risk Advisor podcast hosted by myself, Jim Henry, and Sal Lafreri. We invite you to comment on our blog at theriskadvisor.com and to subscribe and follow us on our social media like Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you are interested in having one or both of us speak at an upcoming event or would like to consult with us, please go to our webpage at theriskadvisor.com to set that up. So we're seeing calls from some quarters to ban the utilization of facial recognition.
Can I just throw a proviso in here?
Yeah.
I'll just apologize for what he may say. The comments you've heard today are not necessarily that of the other co-host. just adding it.
No, but truly, I'm just speaking to the world that we live in right now. I mean, we're seeing with the polarization that's going on, we're seeing the far left going to the extreme of, calling to defund the police and what have you. Is facial recognition just going to be another tool that will be targeted to take away from law enforcement? I mean, they're taking away, stun guns and everything else to enable them, to do their job. Now, here's a tool that obviously can be used very effectively, to get the right bad guys instead of the wrong bad guys. I mean, that's the whole point of law enforcement and police work, is to make sure that you're not falsely accusing someone. Now, here's a tool, that can help them be more accurate. Yet there doesn't seem to be much logic, in what's being applied right now. It's anything that at this point can look to be anti-law enforcement is getting backing. Are you seeing, is this getting swept into that same,
Well, certainly we all see the calls, right, and the concerns and comments from various quarters, and it's, I just read a report actually from University of Michigan, the Ford School there, that looked at this and looked at it specifically in the area of education, all, through K through 12, all the way through higher education, and facial recognition's use in education. And, their recommendation is it shouldn't be used whatsoever. And again, all sorts of good, valid concerns that are brought up. You don't argue with any of those. But my concern or my argument with it really is that, instead of looking at that and saying, so what are the benefits? And it was really fairly one-sided in terms of all the things that can go wrong, right? And we need to look at all of these new technologies, every new technology. I think the concerns around the potential misuse are real. And clearly they're real because we've seen it done, at least in other countries, right? We know this is a technology that can be misused, right? And it's been proven. But the question, and I think the challenge that we have in this time for all of us is that, everything seems to be binary, right? It's either good or bad. It's either okay or not. It's a good technology or it's a bad technology. Technology it isn't inherently good or bad, all right? It depends on how we're going to use it and how people can use it and what processes we put in place. And just as with this analysis from University of Michigan, we looked at one side of the equation. It didn't seem to me when I read through the report, all 80 pages of it, that there was a whole lot of the other side of the equation in terms of all the benefits it can provide. But more importantly, there was very short shrift at the end given to, if we're going to deploy it, what do we need to do? And I think one of the SIA just came out with a set of guidelines and policies that said, hey, this is what we think needs to be done for the safe and ethical application of facial recognition in the markets. And it was a starting point. I thought it was a really very well thought through set of policies and guidelines. It needs a lot of fleshing out in real practice, but it was a really great start. And to me, I'm hopeful that calm heads will prevail and we can get away from the binary aspect of this and say, as with almost everything else in life, it's how we use it. And so let's put the right process, regulations, policies, ethical approaches in place to make sure it's used the way it's supposed to be used. In terms of law enforcement, as an example, I don't think there's anything wrong to say, hey, we have examples where law enforcement used a picture that kind of looked like a guy that we saw, and it was a movie star, and we didn't have a picture of the real suspect, but we used this one that was a movie star, and we fed that into the system and said, you know what? You shouldn't be doing that because that kind of breaks the technology, right? But also sitting there saying, hey, if you got a warrant for somebody, right, and you got their vision and it's a threat, you ought to be looking for them. And we ought to be using every aspect that we have at our disposal, right, to keep people safe. To track down a terrorist, a kidnapper, or whatever else the case may be. So in my mind, there's no reason that we can't get to a place that says, this is what makes sense. We're going to start it with those SIA policies and procedures. We're going to build on that from a regulatory standpoint. But it really takes people willing to have that discussion, look at both sides of the equation,